1,456,000 ships, nearly $450 billion of profit, and just one canal. Former President Theodore Roosevelt says, "No single great material work which remains to be undertaken on this continent is of such consequence to the American people as the Panama Canal. It is the greatest technological feat accomplished in all of American history, one that has revolutionized the world. Without it, trade between numerous countries and continents would have become nearly impossible. Travel by ship would end from myriads of ports, and naval ships would not have an accessible route between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. After rejected treaties, wars and battles which spurred conflicts, numerous compromises, and the labor of more than 75,000 people, this extravagant structure, sometimes referred to as one of the 7 wonders of the world, has an interesting history, ushering in the worlds of politics and engineering. And it is the Panama Canal. The idea of creating a water passage across the Isthmus of Panama to link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans dates back to at least the 1500s, when King Charles I of Spain tapped his regional governor to survey a route along the Chagres River. The realization of such a route across the mountainous jungle terrain was deemed impossible at the time, although the idea remained tantalizing as a potential shortcut from Europe to Eastern Asia. France was ultimately the first country to attempt the task. Led by Count Ferdinand de Lesseps, the builder of the Suez Canal in Egypt, the construction team broke ground on a planned sea-level canal in 1880. The French soon comprehended the monumental challenge ahead of them. Along with the incessant rains that caused heavy landslides, there was no effective means for combating the spread of yellow fever and malaria, diseases that killed over 20,000 French workers. De Lesseps blatantly realized that a sea-level canal was too difficult and reorganized efforts towards a lock canal, but funding was pulled from the project in 1888 as the French realized it was a waste of money and effort.
So the French and de Lesseps decided that they would build a canal in Panama, and it turned out to be a complete disaster. There were 2 things that did it in. One was that the French didn't know how to build a canal effectively, and they didn't have the money that they needed for that kind of an enterprise.
Since the day he came positioned in office on September 14, 1901, President Theodore Roosevelt oversaw the realization of a long-term United States goal, a trans-Isthmian canal. Throughout the 1800s, American and British leaders and businessmen wanted to ship goods quickly and cheaply between the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. Following the deliberations of the U.S. Isthmian Canal Commission and a push from President Theodore Roosevelt, the U.S. purchased the French assets in the canal zone for $40 million in 1902. The area that was planned to be used was called Panama, but it was part of Colombia, a country not ready to give up land to their rival, the United States. In 1903, as a compromise, the Hay-Heron Treaty was signed with Colombia, granting the United States use of the Isthmus of Panama in exchange for financial compensation. The U.S. Senate ratified the treaty, but the Colombian Senate, fearing a loss of sovereignty, refused. In response, President Theodore Roosevelt gave tacit approval to a rebellion by Panamanian nationalists, the first of many conflicts in the history of the Panama Canal. He realized that if he would support the Panamanians to rebel against Colombia, separate from it, and convince them that building the canal in their region would bring them benefit, there would be no problems or discrepancies with the newly formed nation for building and colonizing in that area. To aid the rebels, the U.S.-administered railroad in Panama had removed its trains from the northern terminus of Colón, thus stranding Colombian troops sent to crush the insurrection. Other Colombian forces were discouraged from marching on Panama by the arrival of the U.S. warship Nashville. The rebels were quickly victorious, aided by the presence of American warships sent to intimidate Colombia. On November 6th, President Theodore Roosevelt recognized the new Panamanian regime led by Manuel Amador, who had previously visited the United States seeking promises of assistance. Then, on November 18th, a compromise was settled once again. The Hay-Buenaventura Treaty was signed with Panama, granting the United States exclusive and permanent possession of the Panama Canal Zone. In exchange, Panama received $10 million and an annuity of $250,000 beginning 9 years later. The treaty was negotiated by U.S. Secretary of State John Hay and the owner of the Panama Canal Company.
There's a lot of American naval power down there, and when the moment of truth came, the one thing they did not want was for the United States to withdraw and allow the Colombians to come up and retake Panama. That had happened a couple times in the 19th century, and the Colombians thought it would happen again. But once the United States was there and was tied to the Panamanians by the Buenos-Varela Treaty, Colombians didn't have a chance.
But just after the treaty was placed into effect, it was condemned by many Panamanians as an infringement of their country's new national sovereignty. But they learned by compromising just some of their land, they would receive millions to possibly even billions of dollars of revenue from the canal through trade. Flash forward 1 decade, the Panama Canal was finished and officially opened on August 15, 1914, although the planned grand ceremony was downgraded due to the outbreak of World War I. Completed at a cost of more than $350 million, it was the most expensive construction project in U.S. history to that point. Altogether, some 3.4 million cubic meters of concrete went into building the locks, and nearly 240 million cubic yards of rock and dirt were excavated during the American construction phase. Over time, the canal had brought many uses, some of them being trade, travel, and naval ship transport. The United States was earning millions of dollars through tariffs that had to be paid to use the canal. This, though, was a major drawback for many Panamanians that had hoped to use the canal to their benefit. The tariffs were too high compared to their revenue, angering traders. Not only that, but the U.S. occupation of the Panama Canal Zone was thought to be a violation of Panama's sovereignty.
When Secretary of the Army William Howard Taft assured the Panamanians that the United States would encourage trade between the surrounding nation, that is Panama, and would make purchases in Panama for the construction of the canal, food and water and things of that sort. What had happened is that Congress, sort of unaware of the situation, passed a tariff law that put high duties on any goods that Panamanians sold into the canal zone.
In response, on January 9, 1964, grievances between native Panamanians and Americans residing within the U.S.-controlled Canal Zone boiled over into a series of anti-American riots, which resulted in an evacuation of the U.S. Embassy in Panama City, dozens of deaths, and yet another conflict. In 1977, newly elected President Jimmy Carter, fulfilling a campaign promise, set out to negotiate a new compromise with Panama. He believed that a new treaty was needed to correct what he saw as injustices. In spite of vocal opposition from Congress and the American public, Carter negotiated 2 new treaties. First, the United States would retain the right to defend the canal forever. Second, the canal zone would be turned over to Panama in 1979, and a transfer of the operation of the canal would be complete by 1999. This meant that the U.S. would completely give up their 10-year, $425 million worth, world-renowned canal to another country. It was a big move for the Carter administration, but all said and done, it is recognized as one of the greatest compromises in their presence in U.S. government. Through the multitude of conflicts and compromises, the Panama Canal has delivered its benefits to the world, from boosting international trade, globalization, access to the Navy, and travel. It shows us that no matter how many setbacks, disagreements, or bargains that have to be made to resolve the conflict at hand, we should persevere and achieve our goals in order to broaden good for our society. From the Hay-Huron Compromise to the bargain made by Hay and Buenos-Varela, from rebellions that created new nations to conflicts that changed the tide of Panamanian history, the Panama Canal was created and implemented into the global society all through conflicts and compromises.